pretty good. One more time. How you doing? Good, good. Welcome, welcome. Happy to see all of you turn out on a Sunday afternoon for our panel. Let me introduce myself. My name is Aaron Stuco. I'm the founder and the video game analyst with The Terrible Fate. Happy to be with you today, along with one of my colleagues, Matt McGill. Quick question, just for my own edification. How many people have heard of our site before today? Anyone? All right, we have a few hands. That's okay. We're a small outlet. I'm very honored to be here, obviously, and excited to be talking with you about science fiction video games and how we can get a better handle on them using some real science. So just a little bit of background. I started this site with A Terrible Fate, analyzing video games first by digging into Majora's Mask for 3 months because I got really motivated to study video games philosophically, and I began to think that they had something interesting to say when Nintendo announced that they were remaking Majora's Mask a few years ago. So I did that. I wouldn't advise thinking about Majora's Mask for 3 months in a really intense headspace because that can mess you up in a lot of ways, as we'll see over the next hour or so. But from there we expanded to other games, to not just philosophy of games, but also just academics of games more generally, because it's my firm belief that video games have something really interesting to say in pretty much whatever academic field you're interested in. To that end, we're going to be talking about science today with someone working in neuroscience, Matt McGill. The theme of this panel is effectively, we're going to be talking about 2 games with you. Matt's going to be talking about SOMA, I'm going to be talking about BioShock Infinite. We think that by bringing real science and philosophy of science to bear on these games, we can understand them in new and interesting ways and ultimately come to appreciate what video games can do as a storytelling medium in new and exciting ways. So that's all I have to say by way of introduction. I'm going to turn it over to Matt now, who's going to talk to you about SOMA, and I'll get back to you later with BioShock Infinite.
All right, Aaron, thanks for the introduction. So, as Aaron said, I've been studying neurobiology at college. Finishing up my last semester right now. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about the game of SOMA. So, what are we going to be talking about? So, in SOMA, there's a lot of interesting technology that's being presented. And 2 in particular that we're going to be going into is the idea of a brain scan and the idea of something called the ARC. And the ARC is this virtual world where people's brain information is getting uploaded onto. And what I'm going to be doing with you guys is going through some modern day research into neuroscience to show you that some of the technology that's being presented in SOMA is not as science fiction as it might come off as. So, just really quickly, for anyone who doesn't really know the story of SOMA, I just wanted to run through the gist of what's going on. So the story centers around this man named Simon. And what happens to Simon is he gets in a car accident and he has this terrible brain injury. And he finds out about this new research, this new medical technique called a brain scan that's meant to look at what's going on and find this targeted technique to help him in some way. So Simon goes to the doctor and they strap him up. They say, okay, you're gonna, things are gonna go black. He's gonna get this brain scan, goes to sleep, and then when he wakes up, he's not in the doctor's office anymore. He's actually in this underwater research facility called Pathos 2. And what he comes to find out is that a comet has crashed into the Earth, rendering life on Earth uninhabitable. And the people at this underwater research facility are the only people actually left on Earth. And what they're trying to do is save humanity. So along the way, Simon finds this girl whose name is Catherine. And what we find out is Catherine is actually this brain scan of her former self uploaded onto a computer. So he takes this chip and is putting it in various computers, going throughout the facility and trying to fulfill her original mission of sending this technology, this virtual world called the ARC, into space. It's going to orbit around the Earth and it's going to be powered by the sun, and it's meant to continue humanity on. So Simon goes throughout the facility, helps her out, and he actually comes to find out that he's in a robot body. He's a brain scan of his former self, uploaded onto this robot body. And what I essentially want to go through is there's some crazy technology being presented in SOMA. And the two ones are the brain scan and the ARC. And a quick explanation of what this is. So what the brain scan is some copying of the information that makes up someone's brain, that makes up who they are, including their memories, their personality, etc. And it's being stored in some digital form. Let's say like you can put it on a USB and do what you want with it. And then the ARC, like I mentioned before, is this virtual world where these brain scans are being uploaded onto, it's going to be shot out into space. Now, that's some pretty crazy stuff. So, in order to pick this apart, there are two main questions that I'm thinking about with these brain scans. One is, what does it even mean to copy someone's brain information? It's pretty crazy. There's been a lot of research in neuroscience that's been getting at this question of what is the neural code? What does it mean for information to be encoded in the brain? And then the other thing I want to talk about is, let's say you can get this brain scan, this USB, this chip that has someone's information on it. What do you do with it? Like, how do you put it on a computer, put it on a robot, and all of a sudden things start happening? So before we go into that, for the uninitiated, I want to give a quick neurobiology interlude just to go through some basic concepts so we have something to think about when we go into some of the topics. So the nervous system operates largely with certain cells called neurons, among other cells. They're very special in that what they do is they send electrical signals to each other in order to convey information. What I've zoomed in on is something called a synapse. A synapse is where two neurons are connected to each other, where something amazing happens. So electrical information gets sent down, let's say the axon, which is labeled up here, and it goes to the next neuron. But at the synapse, what actually happens is you go from an electrical signal to a chemical signal, and then back to an electrical signal. And that's actually really amazing because it allows for a lot of interesting, nuanced things to happen in terms of what chemicals are being sent between neurons, the receptors on the two sides of the synapse that allow for some amazing things. So, with that, like I said to you guys before, how is information coded in the brain? This is something that's plagued neuroscience for a long time. What I want to go through are three main theories that neuroscientists have and a lot of research has gone into. The first one is called the rate code. And all that means is that information is generally just the frequency of those electrical signals being sent from one neuron to another. And that frequency is something meaningful. It can tell one neuron information about what's going on. The next theory is something called the temporal code. The temporal code says it's not necessarily frequency, but more in the inner time interval between, let's say, bursts of electrical signals or just single electrical signals. Those things are meaningful. And then the last code is called the synchrony code, which posits that what's sent from a single neuron to another doesn't really mean much. In order to convey something meaningful, and for information to spread throughout the brain to cause you to like move your arm or think about your grandmother's cookies, then a whole population of neurons have to fire together, they have to fire in sync in order to propagate information. Well, okay, there's a lot known about all those three theories, and it's generally thought that it's a combination of all three that are used throughout the brain, and certain areas of the brain might use certain codes more than others. But despite current research not having an exact idea about how information is encoded in the brain, I just want you guys to think about something. You're walking down the street and you go by Dunkin' Donuts and you think about your favorite, donut or order that you like to get there. What that means is that there's a distinct process where you're able to access information in the brain. And this is something called the theory of memory. So, the old theory of memory that had been touted in neurobiology for a long time was that memories are like an art gallery. You can go around and you can see them. We can't really do much else besides that. You can just look at them and think about them, etc. But what's actually going on is that memories are more like filing cabinets. That there are very distinct processes where you have to go and access a memory, and you do something with it, then you have to put it back. Just like you take out a file, you look at it, fill it, change it, and you put it back in the filing cabinet. So there are ways that we can access these memories, this information, if we know more about what cells, how the cells are firing, what information they might be encoding. So I want to walk through some exciting research in biology that has shown that there is some progress going towards this. And the first example I bring up is called a place cell. So place cells they're in a certain area of your brain. What they do is you're in your bedroom, you're in the corner of your bedroom, and you have this neuron that starts sending electrical signals that tells you, I'm in the corner of my bedroom. That's all. It's pretty actually amazing that that's how the brain is telling you navigationally where you are. And what I had as a diagram up on the top left is that we see a mouse going through a track maze, and the different colors represent different neurons that are firing and telling the mouse that it's in certain areas. And then some other interesting research I've shown in the top right is that there's this experiment where they had mice go, let's say I have across a table and I go to find a reward, in this case, some cheese. And when they get to the end, there are place cells that had fired 1, 2, 3 to tell them they're in different areas of the room on the table, actually fire back in reverse. 3, 2, 1, telling perhaps the mouse that this is how I need to get home. And then finally, so this is research into mice, right? So what's going on in humans? There's actually been some interesting research that's been done on epilepsy patients. And I had the task that was given to them on the bottom here, and they figured out something called novelty detectors, where they would give these patients these decks of images that they would just go through, familiarize themselves with, and they give them another deck 20 minutes later that had some images they'd seen before and some new images, and just ask them, have you seen this picture before? And I told the researcher yes or no. They actually found when they recorded in certain areas of the brain, there were certain neurons that fired when they had seen something and when they hadn't seen something before. So the reason why I'm giving you all this information is I want to show you that there is a lot of current research in neurobiology that shows that we're getting towards an understanding of how information is encoded in the brain. And if, let's say, we can do a brain scan, if we want to look at the electrical information, the heat information, based on blood flow that's going on in someone's brain, we can actually extract meaningful information from it based on what someone's thinking about, what their memories are. Perhaps in the future getting some more things about personality. People have been doing more studies of humans to look at those dynamics. So, whether the question is, let's say we can get this brain scan information. Well, again, what do we do with it? So, the nervous system is remarkable, and not only is your brain very specialized for your body, meaning, for the length of your arms, for your pain tolerance, everything's very specialized for you, but it's also highly dynamic. The nervous system is able to change in amazing ways, and this is called neuroplasticity, which means that as you experience the world, your nervous system changes. The way it changes is, you guys remember those synapses that I showed you? The chemicals that are being sent from one neuron to another can alter. The receptors, the number of receptors can change. The length of connections can change. Very amazing structural things can happen. But the question is, if we have this brain scan that's just a bunch of information, how can you do all these things? How can this brain scan not just act like a personality, a set of memories that are stuck in time? What I want to talk about is current research into artificial intelligence and computer chips. So there are new computer chips that are being developed that have millions and millions of nodes that are all connected to each other, with countless connections that are meant to simulate a neural network. And they use specific algorithms. In this case, there's a cognitive computing chip that uses something called the integrate and fire method, which essentially means that one node gets in information from another, as that information has some threshold that it's measuring everything against, and then decides whether or not it wants to signal and send further information. And what I want to tell you is that this current research showing, along with other research into machine learning, you could use this information and be able to train some computer to use someone's brain scan information to perhaps do more remarkable things than just talk to someone's set of memories, but instead have them walk around in this new robot body like Simon's brain scan is able to do. But again, there's some nuances with this where what's missing are those more subtle effects about neurons and the ways that they're connected. But as we start to understand that more and understand more about how is it that these chemicals are changing, how is it that these connections are changing, we can incorporate that into the technology in meaningful ways in order to simulate how our brains are working. Now, what I've gone through hopefully is that these brain scans, by looking at current research into how information is encoded and current research into computer chip technology and artificial intelligence, these brain scans might not be as science fiction as we once thought if you look at the game of SOMA. But that still leaves us with VR, right? We have this virtual world that we're uploading people's brain scans onto. And what does that even mean? How can you do that and then have people start being simulated and walking through a park in this new virtual world? So, what I'm going to talk to you guys about is this new technology called the brain-machine interface. And what I have depicted up here is brain-machine interfaces are used for amputee patients often, people that have lost a limb. What I have shown here is they'll take someone who's lost, in this case, this man has lost his arm. And they put these electrodes on his certain area of his body, in this case, his pectoral muscle. And what these electrodes do is they measure electrical and also like heat. They measure electrical activity and heat. And they'll tell this man to think, so in this case, move your thumb in a particular way. And they'll read out, okay, what does that look like on these electrodes? And they can pretty quickly train a computer to start moving a robot body by having this man think, I'm going to move my arm to the left. I'm going to open my hand. And these robot arms can actually do that. Not only being connected to this huge computer, but people are starting to make these actually portable technologies that can start helping these amputee patients. And what I believe is that if we can take this brain information and translate it into moving a robot arm, it's only a small step, if not even a more simple step, to take someone's brain, simulated brain information in these brain scans and drive an avatar. Move an avatar through a virtual world that's based on certain rules in terms of how it behaves in this virtual world. And in that way, the ARC could be successful if we could take these brain scans and upload them into some simulation. So again, the technology presented in SOMA is a little scary, right? There is some potential in neuroscience and just general computer science and overall that we might be able to scan someone's brain and take someone and put them somewhere else and have multiple mats and multiple errands running around. But what does this mean for the future? How do we think about this? What I want to bring up is a story that actually got me interested in this topic in the first place. And that's the story of this little girl named Ines. And Ines she's a 2-year-old girl who's living in Bangkok. And she got diagnosed with a very rare form of brain cancer. When her parents, they're both, one's a research scientist, one's a doctor, they decided that we wanted to cryogenically freeze our daughter's brain in the hopes that 200 years from now, whatever, it doesn't matter if we're still here, that someone can reanimate our daughter in some way so that she can live once again and have a chance at life. But what I want to ask you guys about is that really what we want to be getting into? You have to realize that when we're doing these brain scans, we're taking someone's information, it's not like we can deactivate a human being and transfer their information somewhere else. It's more like a copy, like a copy and pasting someone. And in the game SOMA, Simon finds out about this. And there's a very interesting scene where he finds out that in order to dive down deeper into Pathos 2 in this underwater research facility, he has to get into a new suit. He's in his robot body, but he's getting into this new diving suit. And Catherine, the girl that he's with, or the brain scan that he's with, tells him that she can scan his brain and send him to this new body. And he's like, okay, cool, just like get sent to this new body and then I'll keep going and everything will be fine. And she tells him like, yep, I'll just like, it'll turn off and you'll appear somewhere else. But what you as the player know is that Simon, he's being copied and pasted somewhere else into this new body and he's being put to sleep. So that when he wakes up, he's just waking up in this one place in this diving suit. He's like, okay, you know, I'm just going to keep going and everything's fine. But there's actually two Simons now. And they're experiencing the world in very different ways. As you experience the world, you form new memories. Your nervous system changes, your brain scan changes, and you actually become someone different. So if we're going to go and copy and paste someone, that's not you anymore. That's a new person that has some old bits of you. So if we want to use a brain scan to try and save someone, we have to realize that they might not be the same person that we were originally trying to save. It's a new person. And then one other question that was raised by SOMA is this arc that's meant to save humanity really going to work? So I'm going to bring up one other scene that happens at the end of SOMA. And still, Simon is clueless to the idea that he is being copied and pasted. He's not being transferred. And what happens is that at the very end, when they're going to shoot this little like box, the arc, off into space, Catherine says, okay, we're going to scan you, and we're going to put you on the arc, and everything's going to be fine. And she doesn't, but the thing is, that happens. Spoiler, I'm sorry. But she doesn't put him to sleep. So we get this interesting two scenes at the end where we see once the arc is sent off, Simon in his current body starts screaming out for Catherine, starts screaming out for someone because he's in Pathos 2. That's his current self, his current consciousness lies there. And he thinks, the brain scan didn't work, I'm still here, why am I still here, what am I going to do? And then we go to the arc. We go to this virtual world, and we see Simon, and he's like, "Great, this worked. Now I'm back, and I'm on the arc, and everything's going to be great." And he doesn't realize that there's this old version of himself, this other him that's back, that's suffering, and that hasn't really been saved. This copy of him has been saved. And what Simon gets presented with on this kiosk is, do you want to deactivate yourself? Do you want to continue with this? Is this a future that you want to have? Are we really saving humanity? Are we really helping humanity with this new technology? It presents some very interesting questions, and I hope you guys can think about it more. But I just want to say thank you for listening to me and taking in some neurobiology, and let's go for the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Matt. Let's give it up for Matt one more time. Ever since I heard his argument the first time, I'm wondering about what brain scan Aaron would be like, so it's an interesting thought. How many people have played this game? Good. Not everyone, so I'll be coming back and collecting the passes of those people who haven't played the game. This shouldn't be a PAX. No, BioShock Infinite, it had quite a good critical reception when it came out, and more to the point in my conversation I'm going to have with you now, it's an inheritor to this long legacy of games that are involved in some way or another with the notion of a multiverse or multiple timelines or things like this. Think of Rick and Morty, Legend of Zelda, even Marvel nowadays, Magic the Gathering. There are all sorts of examples from across media and across types of storytelling where some notion of like multiple versions of the world are invoked in some way. Oftentimes, if you try to make sense of this on the level of like science, you end up having to punch to something more like fantasy and say, okay, this isn't really a parallel of anything that could happen in the real world, but we can still really enjoy it, think about what would happen in different timelines, different versions of playing, or different Ricks and Mortys, things like this. What I want to argue in this presentation with you is that actually BioShock Infinite presents a very scientifically robust way of understanding a multiverse. Ken Levine did a lot of research into quantum mechanics when he was writing BioShock, But I want to go a little further than that. I want to say that the game invites you to consider its quantum mechanics in one really intuitive way that ultimately doesn't make sense. But if we have a good grip on quantum mechanics and some of the theory behind it, we can go for a new interpretation of the game and what's going on in its story that is much more informative and not only lets us better understand BioShock, but lets us understand the unique capacity of video games to tell really compelling, hard science fiction. So that's what we're going to be working on for the next 30 minutes or so. I said BioShock Infinite was really well received, but especially because it's been a few years now since it came out, I want to just jog everyone's memory on how well received it was. It's a long quote by Nick Cohen of The Guardian, but I think it's worth reading in full. BioShock Infinite exists in a pantheon tagged required reading in the gaming medium. In much the same way as Heavy Rain or Dark Souls may not be to everyone's taste, they are still important touchstones in the maturity of games as an art form. BioShock Infinite 2 has an unshakable claim to be challenging what we think games are capable of. That is high praise for a game, if ever I've seen it. And the interesting thing is, certainly there are going to be some people who think BioShock Infinite is overrated, but by and large, I think many video gamers agree that even if they disagree about how BioShock Infinite revolutionized gaming, they all think that something special happened in BioShock Infinite. So what's that all about and how can we really get a handle on it? Well, I'm going to preview what I'll say at the end of the presentation about this, which is that I think the key to understanding why BioShock Infinite is special can actually be arrived at by thinking about an example of another work of literature, actually, by this novelist Italo Calvino, his novella If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. And at one point in the narrative, he talks about the allure of what it means to be a copyist, whereby a copyist he means someone who forges a book that already exists. And in particular, I want to point to the idea that the copyist, on his view, lives in these two temporal dimensions of reading and of writing. And that there's something special going on there, which I'm going to argue is analogous to what happens with the player, both in BioShock Infinite and in other instances of video gaming that allow us to really see the special capacity for the medium science fiction storytelling. Right on. So my claim has been so far that we can understand the special storytelling power of BioShock Infinite by understanding how it incorporates rigorous quantum mechanics. That means we're going to have to dive into some quantum mechanics. So buckle up, it gets crazy really fast. Just a disclaimer, both in what I'm going to say about BioShock's story and in the discussion of quantum mechanics. In the interest of time, I'm going to be oversimplifying both of them. My claim is that I don't oversimplify in any ways that affect the structure of my argument, but Matt and I will be outside for Q&A after this, and you're happy to talk to me about that if you want. We'll start with a simple question. When we think about small particles, and by small I mean like the smallest you can imagine, things like electrons, photons, things of that nature, how do they behave? Because it turns out that these particles act in really, really bizarre ways that boggle the mind. Ken Levine was quoted as saying, when he was researching the game, he found that quantum mechanics really existed sort of at the limits of human understanding. Like, it almost escapes your grasp even as you're reading about it and trying to learn about it. So I'm going to run you through this experiment. You can think of it as a thought experiment, and I think it's fairly intuitive, but it's important to note this has actually been done by scientists. So there's real empirical evidence to what I'm going to be talking about. So the experimental setup. Let's imagine on this side of the screen, right, that we have some sort of a little electron gun. That is a device that shoots out electrons in a straight path. And what it's doing is it's shooting them from a sufficiently far distance at a wall with two slits in it, hence the name double slit experiment, where it's sufficiently far away that if the electrons are to pass through the wall at all, through either of those slits, they'll all pass through at the same angle. And then, once they pass through the slits, if they do, they'll hit a back wall at some location. So, easy question. Where are the electrons going to end up if they pass through the slits? The intuitive answer that seems almost too obvious to give is, because they're all passing through either one slit or another at the same angle, like I just said, what you'll get is two bands on the back wall that correspond to the angles they've passed through, and the electrons will just hit different heights, but they'll constitute together two distinct bands on the back wall. This is in line with thinking that, if you were to shoot macroscopic objects like bullets through slits in a wall in the same way, even though it'd be a bit more violent, the pattern you would get on the back wall would be the same thing. Makes sense, right? Turns out, that's not at all what we observe. So if you run this experiment and you let the electrons do their thing, and then you have a way of seeing where they ended up on the back wall, it turns out that you get 5 bands in really weird locations that don't at all correspond to the 2 bands that our intuitions tell us should be there. Even weirder, the exact positions of the bands correspond alarmingly well with calculations we can make if we assume that the electrons are behaving not like particles, but like waves. So this is also represented graphically here. Suppose that we have a medium of something like water and we're rippling waves through it. So each of the bands on the left side can be a wave. If the wave were to go and hit the wall of the 2 slits, then it would basically split into 2 waves that would then interfere with each other and form this pattern that we see of distinct bands where it hits the back wall after all that interference. The idea is that if we model each electron with what's called a wave function, and you can think of that just as a mathematical way of modeling its wave-like behavior, then it turns out that using that function, we can predict with incredible accuracy the probabilities of each electron ending up in one of those bands at the back wall, as we see here. Again, extremely different from what we were expecting here. So, electrons acting like waves. We thought electrons were supposed to be particles, little packets of matter. What's going on? We need a way to find this. We're scientists, we're obsessed with knowing the truth about things. If there's some weird phenomenon that needs explaining, we can design a new experiment to figure it out. So, here's an idea. It seems like whatever the electrons are doing, it happens around where those slits occur, right? Because we think they're going to go through the slits in this one way as discrete particles. Instead, they pass through with all the behavior of waves. So, let's try to catch the electrons in the act. More specifically, let's put some sort of a recording device right in front of the slits, right? So that the idea is we can see whether the electron is going through one slit or the other slit, or if it's doing some weird third thing that we can then explain. We can say, got you, electron, now we know what you're doing. You can't fool us scientists. So let's do this. Now we have the result that we expected in the first place. And I want to emphasize to you for a moment just how weird this is. The only thing we've changed in the experimental setup is add this measuring device between before the 2 slits of the wall. And one of the basic assumptions of science, the reason we can do science, is that it's possible to measure a system and figure out what's going on in it without thereby changing the way the system operates. But what's happening in quantum mechanics is that merely by adding a measuring device, the electrons are now behaving like particles instead of waves. What's going on here? This seems even weirder than when they were behaving like waves, because now it seems like, based on whether or not we measure them, they behave in these 2 totally different ways that are incompatible with each other. And to motivate this a little more precisely, and to see where we can get into different interpretations of these experiments, I'm going to reframe what I just talked about in a more precise way with what philosophers and scientists call the measurement problem. So the idea is, the experiment that I just talked about and other experiments like it give us really good experimental reason to endorse these 3 claims, which taken together are mutually inconsistent with one another. The first being, all the physical properties of a system, like electrons, groups of electrons, whatever, can be completely described by a wave function, like we talked about. The second one, which there's more rigorous mathematics behind, but is intuitive just when you say it like this, is wave functions always act like waves. There's no sense in which a wave function can stop describing a wave and start describing something else. That's just not how wave functions work. And then thirdly, this weird thing that comes from when we add the recorder to our measurements. When we measure particles, they suddenly end up being in determinate positions as opposed to being in this weird wave-like state of passing through both slits at the same time. You can run through the logic on your own, but the idea is that if you assent to any 2 of those claims, then it's impossible to consistently endorse the third claim, which means that if we want a consistent view of what's happening on the microscopic level of our universe, we need to throw out at least one of these claims. And importantly, this is all that the science can tell us at the level of empirical observation. So this is where philosophy of science comes in. The idea being that if you in fact want a consistent view of the fundamental physics of the world, we can't use actual scientific experiments to go beyond this, and so we need to appeal to other theoretical virtues in order to find out which one of these claims we should throw out. Maybe science can get at a more robust answer one day, but it doesn't seem right now like that's possible. So what I'm going to be talking to you about are 2 interpretations of quantum mechanics, each of which throws out different of these claims. And I'm going to show you how one seems like a really intuitive way to describe BioShock Infinite, but I think is ultimately the wrong way. So let's talk about the first strategy. The first strategy is what's called the Copenhagen or textbook interpretation of quantum mechanics. Textbook in a literal sense, because this is quite directly what most textbooks on quantum mechanics say is going on in the double slit experiment. The story goes like this. So remember, claim 2 is that wave functions always behave like waves. The Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics says, yeah, that's true most of the time, but this weird thing happens when we measure particles. And the weird thing is what the Copenhagen interpretation calls a collapse event. What that means is that when a particle that's in this weird wave-like state of going through both slits at the same time gets measured, then that measurement actually causes in some way the particle to collapse to being in a definitive position of going through either one or the other of those slits. So you can think of the wave as like the particle in some sense going through both slits or being disposed to go through both slits. Measurement happens, suddenly it's going through one slit or another, and importantly, which slit it's going through is purely a matter of probability. There's nothing that we can say, and no further explanation, Copenhagen interpretation says, about which slit the electron ends up going through. It's purely a matter of chance, and we can predict those probabilities really well using the wave functions of particles, but that's all we can say. We can say, here are these probabilities. That gives us a really good way of predicting where the electrons will end up. That's it. Very different strategy is provocatively called many worlds. And remember, claim 3, which many worlds rejects, is maybe the most intuitive claim, which is that when we do these measurements on systems of electrons or photons or whatever, we see definite outcomes. So the particle, in fact, ends up being in one position or another, whereas it was previously a wave. Many worlds says that's not what happens at all. In fact, when you measure a system like an electron going through the double slit experiment, the electron does in fact go through two slits. What happens is you only observe it going through one slit because when you measure it, all of reality splits. That is, the universe itself bifurcates into two different worlds, in one of which the electron goes through the top slit, and you see it going through that slit, and in the other world it goes through the bottom slit, and you see it going through that slit. So why do you not observe this? Because you are bifurcating with the rest of the universe. So there's one possibility in which you see the electron go through the top, one possibility in which you see it go through the bottom, and in that sense there's almost two possible U's that emerge out of this measurement event. And the really weird thing that pretty immediately follows from many worlds is that you can extend this to anything properly considered a measurement event of the system. So, broadly and loosely speaking, if you think something's a possible way that things could have gone, many worlds tells you there is in fact a world out there, some branch of reality, where it did go that way. If I go to, as a rhetorical device, pretend to hit Matt in this presentation, there's a world in which I really did hit him, and I should probably apologize for my actions in that world. That's the kind of view of reality that many worlds is actually giving us. What does this have to do with BioShock Infinite? Well, if you played the game when I was talking about many worlds, you probably were already saying, oh yeah, that sounds very BioShock Infinite. But I'm going to walk through the story just a little bit to ground what I'll be saying about the game. And again, this is sort of a rough overview just to give us the data that we need. So you show up at the beginning of the game, it's 1912, you're Booker DeWitt, you're being rowed in a boat by this mysterious person whose identity you don't know yet to this lighthouse. And you're given a mysterious goal. Anyone know the goal that Booker's given at the beginning of the game? Bring us the girl and wipe away the debt. Booker's like, what girl? What debt? Who are you? I don't know what's going on, just so the player. What is this mysterious goal? But he takes the goal and he goes into the lighthouse, which is also a rocket passage to Columbia, the city in the sky. And through a series of events there, he encounters and enters into conflict with the tyrannical leader of Columbia, Zachary Comstock, religious zealot / tyrant, if you will. We see Comstock there, we see Booker there. They look pretty similar, don't they? Turns out, they're very similar. In fact, according to the game, they are two different versions of the same person. So, as I told you, the main events of the game take place in 1912, but the key event that grounds the many worlds that emerge from the game is the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890 that Booker took part in as a pretty violent soldier. And after the battle was over, Booker was offered the chance to be baptized, which we see in the uppermost shot. And so, here's a choice point in the universe. The thought is, reality actually bifurcated in accordance with this choice point. And so, there are various worlds or universes or timelines, or however you want to think of it, in which Booker said, yes, I will be baptized, please absolve me of my sins. And in those worlds, he actually ended up growing into Zachary Comstock, the very person who Booker's fighting in this game. In other realities, he said, no thanks, I'm not going to be baptized. Goodbye. And those are the worlds in which he remained as Booker, and it's one of those worlds that we enter into, controlling Booker as the player in the story. Turns out, there's sort of an infinite number of these universes. So your companion throughout the game is at first you think the actual daughter of Zachary Comstock, the girl of Bring Us the Girl and Wipe Away the Debt, Elizabeth. Turns out Elizabeth has somewhat of a tortured history. She was actually Booker's kid. So Comstock, when he started rising to power as a religious zealot, ended up, through interaction with these scientists, the Luteches, who were also different versions of each other, figuring out how to basically manipulate the quantum fabric of reality in order to make himself look like a prophet, see into other timelines, and sort of exploit those possibilities to rise to power and domination and tyranny. Turns out, by overusing these quantum mechanical technologies, because once you can do that, why would you not do it all the time? He ended up rendering himself sterile. So, leader of this huge world in the sky, wants an heir, can't produce one naturally. What do you do when you have access to other timelines but you're sterile? You steal a kid from another version of yourself, obviously, which is what he did to poor Booker. So Booker doesn't remember this at the beginning of the game, but in fact, the Elizabeth with whom he teams up to defeat Comstock is actually a version of his own daughter, Anna, who was stolen from him by the scientists working with Comstock. We basically started this cycle of violence where Comstock was able to rise to power, and ultimately the Luteches, the scientists, wanting to try to stop this, recruited Booker to try to stop Comstock and end the cycle of violence. Turns out, the Luteches are pretty old hands at this, just to say that this is not a single storyline that I've talked about. Rather, the thought is that you discover at the end of the game, there are infinite versions of Comstock and infinite versions of Booker, and this is a cycle of daughter theft and violence and rise to domination that has been going on basically throughout all timelines. You can think of it that way. And so the ultimate idea behind Bring Us the Girl and Wipe Away the Debt, the game would have us think, is find a way to stop this never-ending cycle of violence across timelines. The way the game suggests that we can do that, at first pass at least, is in its penultimate sequence, more or less. So Elizabeth, in virtue of having been stolen from timelines and a portal closing directly on her finger, she's supposed to exist in two worlds because of that. Because she exists in two worlds, she herself has these interesting quantum mechanical powers where she can open portals to other timelines, take Booker through them, things like this. At the end of the game, she unlocks all of her quantum powers, which is to say that she can see all of the possibilities of the world in all branches of the timeline, which you see represented here in this iconic shot where she takes Booker to just this field of lighthouses, and she says to Booker, there's always a lighthouse and there's always a girl, suggesting again that there are just infinite iterations of him undergoing this trial against infinite versions of the Comstock across all of space-time. And what she discovers, in conjunction with a lot of other versions of herself, is that the way to wipe away the debt is to annihilate Booker at the moment where he was offered baptism. And if you followed the understanding of the game so far, which I think is the natural one, this kind of makes sense, because if this cycle of violence between timelines and daughter theft and everything rests on the choice that Booker made at the moment of baptism, what do? Find a way to eliminate Booker's choice from the equation of the universe. Natural way to do that, the game says, well, you better drown him in the baptismal font before he gets a chance to be baptized. So Elizabeth takes him back there, drowns him, and apparently the world is supposed to be saved as a result of that. The credits roll in the game. Then something else that's really interesting happens. After the credits roll, you're treated to another scene. You're back in 1893, with Booker in his apartment. He calls out to his daughter, Anna, and goes to open the door to the room where she would be. And before you can see whether or not she's there, fade to black. What's that all about, you might wonder? And it's really hard to make sense of that on the interpretation of the game that I've just given, that I think most people subscribe to. So I'll return to that in a moment, but flag it in your mind as something that might be important. There's an intuition that comes even after all that I've said, that the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is the most natural and obvious way to understand what's going on in this game. So not only do you have Elizabeth, as you see here, being able to open portals to other versions of reality, such as a version in which the last of the original Star Wars films was in fact named The Revenge of the Jedi, but Booker's last name, as I mentioned to you, is DeWitt. A little bit of history of science here. The person who was responsible for developing the many worlds theory that I was talking about earlier, Bryce DeWitt. This is not an accident. Ken Levine, again, researched all of this. He knew what he was doing. And so it seems like the game is inviting you to consider its world as basically an exploration of what it would be like if many worlds was true of our universe. What sort of wild stories could ensue as a result of that. Makes sense, right? Problem is, the more that you think about it, the less it does make sense. Even beyond the typical problems of science fiction, where of course it's not science, it's science fiction. I contend that if you take this interpretation seriously, it's incredibly hard to make sense of the events of BioShock Infinite specifically. So first, you can think of the generic problems with time travel or inter-timeline travel. Basically, the thought is it's incredibly hard to make sense of concepts like causation or the process of time if you have the notion that various timelines can interact with one another. This is a very general problem with timeline stories that have time travel in some way or another. Many worlds specifically, though, as a theory, if you want to be fidelitous in some way to many worlds, can't get off the ground as a theory if you have the notion that the various worlds in many worlds overlap or can intersect with one another in the way that they obviously do in BioShock. That notion would not allow us to have a coherent idea of reality in the first place. It wouldn't lead to us seeming to observe determinate outcomes to measurements. So that already requires us to step somewhat away from the meat of the theory. But again, if you're trying to understand, like, how was an event brought about in a story, which seems like a really natural question to ask of any narrative, if you have this idea where the fundamental constituents of a timeline can be modified in an instant by another timeline, which seems to be exactly what BioShock requires of us with this idea that Anna was stolen from time into another timeline. It's very hard to try to understand cause and effect in this discrete way where cause comes before effect and time brings it about. Because time doesn't even seem to be suitably consistent for that notion of causation to come about. Time is always being changed and altered based on other timelines. It seems like we can't abstract away enough from that in order to really understand what's going on. But suppose you hear that and you say back to me, fine, again, it's science fiction. You're being ridiculous to hold it to the standards of science. You're missing the point. That's fine, but again, I think there are real concerns with BioShock's narrative specifically that come about if we think about its story in this way. Notice, I said that in order to resolve the cycle and wipe away the debt, yada, 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 Elizabeth drowns Booker, thereby effectively annihilating him and removing him from the possibility space of timelines at the moment of his baptism in 1890. The events of the game that you played through take place following Booker in 1912, which, if it's true that he was annihilated at the moment of baptism, literally couldn't have happened. I want to just dwell on this for a moment so that you can see how problematic it is for understanding the narrative. You might think there are plenty of narratives that are sort of nihilistic in the following sense. Sure, they tell a story, but the author is suggesting to you that ultimately, in some way, their events are meaningless. There was no real choice for the characters, or there really is no morality in the universe, things like this. That's not what I'm suggesting happens in BioShock. It's not just that you look back from the perspective of Booker being wiped out from the timeline and say, oh, I guess those events that I just played through didn't have any meaning. Rather, if you're trying to understand the narrative, once you arrive at the conclusion of the storyline where Elizabeth wipes Booker out, you literally don't have the resources within the narrative to talk about the events leading up to that point in the story. Which is to say, those events with Booker that happened in 1912 that you've been playing through the whole time as a player literally didn't happen if Elizabeth was successful in wiping them out of space-time, as the game suggests. So you can't talk about the meaning or whether those events were meaningless. You can't say anything about them at all because they're non-events. You might think that's a bad result if a story effectively nullifies itself so that if you're being true to the narrative, you can't say anything about it. I think that's a bad result. And lastly, as I talked about before, the game's very final scene, post-credits, where Booker shows up in his apartment in 1893. Similar thought. If he was really wiped out of timelines of existence in 1890, how does it make sense that we're seeing him apparently waking up 3 years later in a timeline. Maybe there's some way to craft a theory of many worlds that explains that, but I submit it would be pretty ad hoc because the game doesn't seem to support it in any direct way. These, I think, are problems that, even if they're not decisive for this natural interpretation of BioShock that I think many people endorse, are at least sufficient reason jointly considered to look for another theory that maybe does a better job of understanding the game, which is what I want to do with you now. Let's return to this idea that I previewed in the beginning of Calvino's copyist. And well, specifically again on this notion that the copyist can live in two dimensions of reading and writing at the same time. And to draw that out a bit more specifically with the example of video games, what I want to suggest is that the player of a video game can read and write the video game at the same time. That is to say, it's not just that video games are superficially interactive. Rather, just as you're playing the game and consuming the story of the game, at the same time, you are yourself participating in the narrative, which is to say that your actions as a player are in part constitutive of that narrative. They have fictional significance. What does that look like? Well, let's turn back to BioShock Infinite, and I'll give you an interpretation that directly invokes the actions of the player, and we'll see what that looks like more directly. Go back to the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. This is the textbook interpretation that says, yeah, fine, wave functions mostly act like waves, except for this weird collapse thing, where systems that are wave-like collapse in a completely random manner to one determined position or another when you measure them. Here is the situation you have in a video game at first glance. You have a discrete universe that the video game represents within your TV set or on your 3DS or Switch, as the case may be, or what have you. And you have a player that's engaging that universe external to it. That looks shockingly like a system, a discrete system that is being observed from the outside, or you might think, measured from the outside. Why does that matter? Well, because you might think that you could at least mount an interpretation of the game in which the game's discrete universe is behaving in a wave-like way until the player picks up the controller, thereby playing the game, and in the act of playing the game, measuring the system of the universe. So that the player's very act of playing the game causes the universe to collapse into one determinate timeline in a random fashion, just as the electron we talked about collapses randomly into being in one position or another. This is what I want to say about BioShock Infinite. I think its story makes much more sense and is also much more faithful to actual ideas of science and theories of quantum mechanics if we interpret its story as a metaphor for the collapse event in a Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. Why does this tie in with the notions that I mounted against the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, or of BioShock Infinite, rather? Well, again, notice that many of these focus on the idea that if you take seriously the many worlds interpretation, a lot of things in the storyline are rendered just inexplicable. Things about time travel and causation and what happens with Booker. I think the specific kind of inexplicability that emerges from the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics actually mirrors quite well the inexplicability that we see in BioShock Infinite, in such a way that it supports this interpretation. So, recall that I said, when a collapse event happens, a system goes from being wave-like to being determinate in a totally random way, and that's all we can say. Richard Feynman, one of the fathers and pioneers of studies in quantum mechanics, said specifically, this is where explanation falls out. If you're asking me, why did collapse happen? Or why did an electron end up collapsing to being in one position rather than another? You're asking an ill-posed question, because that kind of thing just can't be explained. And so, similarly, I think, with this interpretation where the player's interaction with the world of BioShock Infinite causes a collapse event, you can say, well, sure, the interactions between timelines seem inexplicable, and if we look closely at them, we can't actually explain them in a logically consistent way. But that's actually the right result, because you're not supposed to be able to explain a collapse event. We're basically engaging with a game that is a metaphor for an inexplicable phenomenon in science, this event of collapse. And so you might think, well, yeah, but I wish I really could explain it. But that's the same way in science. You might wish you could really explain collapse, but science says, no, sorry, you're barking up the wrong tree if you're trying to do that. More specifically, return to the last scene of the game. The very last scene, post-credits, Booker's back in his apartment. Again, seems really weird that he was wiped from all possible timelines 3 years before that scene. But this is exactly the right result if we're thinking about the game as a metaphor for collapse. Because, again, once collapse happens, the entire system of possibilities contained in the wave function ends up having just one determinate component as its outcome. So, if you're measuring an entire universe of possible realities, when a collapse event happens, you're going to have one determinate branch of reality, or one fixed universe as the outcome. So, if collapse happens, and all these various versions of Booker, some which are Booker, some which are Comstock, collapse into a single universe, you're going to get a random universe, because again, the matter of collapse is stochastic, it's random. So, recall that in that final scene, not only are you back with a copy of Booker, but you don't know whether Anna's in the room or not. The game specifically doesn't show you that. On my interpretation, that also makes sense, because, again, that is suggesting that it's not entirely clear which reality you've collapsed to. Anna could be there, it could be a version of reality in which Booker had a daughter, named her Anna, etc., etc. Or it could be a version of reality in which Booker didn't have a daughter. Maybe he just dreamt about a daughter or something, and that's why he's calling out Anna at the end. But there's no Anna behind that door. And so the vagueness inherent in that last scene is actually helpful in this interpretation, because it helps to capture the intuition that if this is going to be a collapse event that the game is symbolizing, it has to have a random outcome. We see that pretty clearly too. I think more generally, what I love about BioShock in this regard is that it's not just well contained as a metaphor exploring what this inexplicable phenomenon of collapse in quantum physics might look like if we explored it on a macroscopic level. That is, all of the chaos that would ensue in reality, all of the versions of ourselves melding with one another. Basically, all of the wild things we see happen, especially near the end of BioShock Infinite, when reality is basically melting together and collapsing in on itself. Even beyond that, I think BioShock stands up as a model for ways in which video games can tell really great and really compelling science fiction on the level of comprehensive theories of the universe. Again, recall that the way we arrived at this theory of BioShock Infinite was by positing the player as a narratively efficacious agent. That is, someone who we can invoke in explaining the narrative itself. The player's actions are what invoke the collapse event. I think if we think about video games in this way, where the video game itself can represent a discrete universe that the player looks in on and affects in different ways, we can explore the fundamental theories of the universe in ways that are not available to us in the real world. So these interpretations of quantum mechanics, right, they're theories about how our entire universe works. You might think there's something hard about that, and the reason why it's difficult to adjudicate between them is because we ourselves are confined to this universe. So it's not as if we can look at the universe and study it from an outside perspective and see what its shapes and laws are like. We're confined to it. But in a video game, a developer can very easily create a universe with the contours he wants, with the laws that he wants to invoke on those universes, and then we can look at the universe and explore it from the outside as a player. So we can get exactly that perspective on the fictional universe that we can't get on our own universe. A way of seeing this even further in BioShock Infinite is that even though I've talked about a better interpretation being available using the Copenhagen interpretation, it's almost as if the game combines many worlds and the collapse event of Copenhagen in a way that's not possible in the real world. So in the real world, those are two distinct and mutually incompatible theories of quantum mechanics, right? But in BioShock, you might say, think about the universe of the game with all the Comstocks and Bookers before the player ever picks up the controller and engages the game, right? That universe, with its wave-like behavior and multiple realities, seems really many worlds, right? There are a bunch of different branches of reality with a bunch of different possibilities. Fine, just like what we might think of many worlds being if it were true of our real world. But then, the player, an external agent to the universe, comes and measures that many worlds universe, and it collapses into a single, definite world. In this way, through using the medium of storytelling, we're able to explore a combination of two discrete theories of the universe by positing this external agent who can act upon a universe in a way that just isn't possible or coherent when we're looking at our real world. So in that way specifically, I think that using the lessons of BioShock Infinite and a philosophy of quantum physics to think about science fiction and video games more robustly is really promising for developing more hard science fiction games in Levine's sense and in the sense of BioShock Infinite. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you enjoyed Matt's work too. If you liked what you saw here, we're on social media, on Facebook and Twitter, so feel free to tweet at us, get in touch with us there. But thank you again for coming. I hope you love the rest of PAX. It's been a pleasure speaking.